emperor, in order to consolidate the empire against Islam and to acquire authority over the church, particularly over the influence of the monks who fiercely defended the use of icons. And of course, much of the iconography came from the great monasteries, decided that they were going to try to crush it completely. So in the year 753, there is an iconoclast council, and this council ratifies. By this time, the first iconoclast emperor, Leo V, has been succeeded by Constantine V, who has a rather sordid last name, Constantine Copronymos. He was called that in mockery after his death. It means that when he was a baby and was put into the baptismal font, he had an accident. And that's how he came to be called throughout his life. So, anyhow, this iconoclast council authorizes the destruction of all the icons. People are not allowed to have them in their homes. They're not allowed to be venerated in the churches. And as a result of it, a terrible persecution, equal to the persecutions in the early centuries by Rome, breaks out against the faithful people and clergy and monks who continue to do what they have always done. For the most part, iconoclasm is in force. It's enforced by the emperor and the military. Where the emperor is, there is always the military, especially when it's the case of the Roman emperor. If you're the emperor, you have to have the army with you, because if you don't, you're sunk. The army can create a new emperor as easy as get rid of an old one, and they do it many times. So the emperor has the force of the army, and also is able, and this is again one of those tragic things that happens in the life of the church, is able to convince many of the bishops also to embrace iconoclasm. And the bishops that will not are driven into exile, deprived of their sees and driven into exile. So it's in the military and in the court and in the higher authorities of the church that iconoclasm becomes most deeply rooted. The lay people almost exclusively, categorically reject it. The monks are its violent enemies, and also the what we would call the lower clergy. You know, the average Joe parish priest is not about to get rid of the icons in his church, unless the army turns up and drags them out and burns them, as happened many times. So, in order to, because of course the authority and the regard that particularly the monks are held in by the people, the worst of the iconoclast persecution is directed against the monks, and I'll read you a brief account of one of the martyrs called Saint Stephen the New. In the year 764, that decade that follows the iconoclast council, sometimes called the Decade of Blood. Saint Stephen, surnamed the Younger or the New, one of the most renowned martyrs in the persecution by the iconoclasts, was born at Constantinople. And his parents placed him when he was 15 years old in the monastery of St. Auxentius. His work was to fetch the provisions daily for the monastery. The death of his father obliged him to make a journey to Constantinople, where he sold his share of the estate and distributed the money among the poor. He had 2 sisters, one of whom was already a nun. The other he took with his mother into Bithynia. Bithynia is north in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, where he found them a home in a monastery. When John the abbot died, Stephen, though only 30 years of age, was placed at the head of the monastery. This was a number of small cells scattered up and down a mountain, and the new abbot succeeded his predecessor in a cave on the summit, where he joined labor with prayer, copying books and making nets. After some years, Stephen resigned as abbot and built himself a remoter cell, so narrow that it was impossible for him to lie or stand up in it at ease. He shut himself up in this cell in his 42nd year. The Emperor Constantine Copronymus carried on the war which his father Leo had begun against holy images, his efforts being chiefly leveled against the monks, from whom he expected and received the most resolute opposition. Knowing the influence of Stephen, he was particularly anxious to get his subscription to the decree passed by the iconoclast bishops at the Council of 753-54. They tried to persuade the saint to consent, but they sent rather a noble man, Callistus, who tried to persuade the saint to consent, but he had to report failure. Constantine, angry at St. Stephen's resolute answer, sent Callistus back with soldiers in order to drag him out of his cell. They found him so weak in body that they were obliged to carry him to the bottom of the mountain. Witnesses were suborned to accuse the saint, and he was charged with having criminal relations with his spiritual daughter, the holy widow Anne. She protested he was innocent. And because she would not say as the emperor wished, she was beaten and then confined to a monastery, where she soon died after of the hard usage she suffered. The emperor, seeking a new excuse to put Stephen to death, trapped him into clothing a novice, which had been forbidden him, whereupon armed men dispersed his monks and burnt down the monastery and the church. They took St. Stephen, put him roughly on board a ship, and carried him to a monastery at Chrysopolis, where several court bishops came to examine him. They treated him first with civility and afterwards with extreme harshness. He asked them how they could call a general council one which was not approved by the other patriarchs. That's the iconoclast council. And stoutly defended the honor due to holy images, insomuch that Stephen was condemned to banishment to the island of Proconnesus. 2 years after, Emperor Copronymus ordered him to be removed to a prison in Constantinople, where some days later he was carried before the emperor, who asked him whether he believed that men trampled on Christ by trampling on his image. See, that's the whole thing. Is the image the same as the one it represents? God forbid, said Stephen. But then, taking a piece of money, he asked what treatment was deserved by one who should stamp upon the image of the emperor. The suggestion was received with indignation. Is it then, asked St. Stephen, so great a crime to insult the image of the King of the earth, and none to cast into the fire that of the King of heaven? The emperor commanded that he should be flogged. This was done with brutal violence, and the emperor, when he heard that Stephen was nevertheless yet alive, cried out, "Will no one rid me of this monk?" Whereupon some of his hearers ran to the jail, seized the martyr, and dragged him through the streets by his feet. Many struck him with stones and staffs till one dashed out his brains with a club. This scene was repeated in hundreds of cases during this decade. There's one rather colorful lady who is in one of those, we perhaps shouldn't ask too many questions of how she got enrolled in the calendar of the saints, but she did. Her name was Theodosia, and she was in one of the women's monasteries in Constantinople. And when she heard that the soldiers were taking down the great icon of Christ over one of the gates of Constantinople, she went in a procession with her nuns and shook the ladder and killed him, and was put to a horrible death as a result of that. Whether it was her intention to kill him or to knock him down is not clear, but he died. So there was great strife during this period and much bloodshed. In the meantime, of course, many of the monks flee, and at this period, many of the monks from Constantinople and from the surrounding area, from Greece, flee to Italy. They flee to southern Italy, and the Pope receives them with open arms, because, of course, the Pope rejects this attack against the images. So, finally, because of the influence of one of the great heroes of this period, St. John of Damascus, the church, and when we say the church, we always mean, because, of course, the iconoclast bishops said they were speaking as the mouthpiece of the church. But those who speak as the mouthpiece of the church are those who are speaking the truth. And sometimes they are found in unlikely places, as we have seen with St. Maximus the Confessor. And in the case of this time, we have to look to what was an obscure monk named John, living in Damascus, so therefore living outside the empire. Damascus is under Muslim rule. Yet it is St. John of Damascus who, in addition to everything else that he did for the life of the church, so much of our hymnography in the Book of the Eight Tones, or the Octoikos, that we sing on all the usual Sundays of the year, all the hymns of the resurrection, and many of the great canons that are sung at Matins on the great feasts, Pascha, and Nativity, and Theophany, and many of the other days are written by the great hymnographer, St. John of Damascus. But he also writes 3 treatises in defense of the holy icons, in which he articulates what is to be the expression of what the church has always believed. First of all, St. John of Damascus makes a distinction between various kinds of worship. He says there is absolute worship that is given to God alone, and then there are relative degrees of worship. This relative worship is most frequently translated into English with the word veneration. However, in St. John of Damascus usage, the same word is used for what we are used to hearing as adoration, what is given to God alone, and veneration. We have those 2 distinct words. What St. John of Damascus did was he used worship in both cases, but he says there is absolute worship and there is relative worship. And he says relative worship is given first and foremost to the Mother of God, and then to the saints, and then to each other, he says. We owe, as members of the body of Christ, we owe a relative worship, a veneration to each other, and also to the holy icons. Secondly, St. John of Damascus says that the image and the prototype of the image are distinct. Therefore, an icon of Christ is not Christ. It is an icon of Christ. And the veneration, and in this sense, St. John of Damascus quotes St. Basil the Great. He says that the veneration, the relative worship that is given to the image, is immediately passed to the prototype, so that when we honor the icon, we are not honoring the wood and the paint and the artistic arrangements of them, but rather that honor that we give to the image passes to the prototype, to Christ himself. And even when we honor the saints and when we honor each other in a relative way, that honor is given in the end to God. So that because all of the saints, man being created in the image and likeness of God, and the saints are those in which that image has reached the destiny for which God intends. So therefore, all the saints are images of Christ. Every icon is an icon of Christ. Thirdly, St. John of Damascus says that we cannot and must not say that the Holy Eucharist is an image or an icon of Christ. Rather, the Holy Eucharist is Christ. And the Holy Eucharist was never intended to be used as a visual image. You look at the Holy Eucharist and you see only bread and wine. The Eucharist was not given by Christ as an image that speaks to the senses. the Eucharist is a mystery beyond the senses. But the bread and wine of the Eucharist are the means by which Christ has chosen, and the Church has always held, that he himself becomes personally present in his incarnate body. So this distinction between the visual image and the Holy Eucharist is very important, because it says once and for all that we cannot in any sense speak of the Eucharist as being an image. Fourthly, St. John of Damascus says that the second commandment, and if you read his treatises concerning the holy icons, he spends a great deal of time on this. The second commandment was never understood as an absolute prohibition of any sort of visual image, even in the Old Testament. And of course, he is the one that points out what Orthodox have never ceased to point out since, that if one is reading the book of Exodus, where the commandment is given, you shall make no graven images, all one has to do in a modern English Bible is turn 2 pages and see where God is saying, you shall make graven images, namely of the seraphim, for the cherubim, for the Ark of the Covenant. So the prohibition is understood to mean that, first of all, idols similar to those that were worshipped by the pagans cannot be made by Christians. Any image that is to be used as an idol cannot be made. But also, secondly, and this is a very important aspect of St. John of Damascus's teaching, that in the Old Testament, before the incarnation of Christ, it was impossible to make an image of God, because God had not yet taken to himself flesh. God had not become man. So therefore, it was impossible to depict any of the persons of the Holy Trinity, and that's why it's forbidden in the second commandment. But with the incarnation, something truly new has happened. See, those who are familiar with the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes know that it asks the question, is there anything new under the sun? See, the answer of the Church is that there's one thing new under the sun. The one thing new under the sun is that God has become man and has come to live under the sun. And this is no little thing. And because God himself has become a man, it is therefore not only good, but necessary to depict him as he is. So I'll read you a little passage of St. John of Damascus. In former times, God without body or form could in no way be represented. But today, since God has appeared in the flesh and lived among men, I can represent what is visible in God. I do not worship matter, but I worship the creator of matter, who became matter for my sake, who assumed life in the flesh, and who through matter accomplished my salvation. And then he goes on to say, crying out even rather emotionally, you will never tear me away. You will never separate me from the matter through which my salvation was accomplished. That is the incarnate body of Christ, which is depicted visually in the icons. So, in the theology of St. John of Damascus, therefore, we have this vindication of everything that's been said in the previous 6 councils, that you cannot divide the divinity and humanity of Christ and analyze them as separate natures. Natures exist only in a personalized form. So, therefore, in the incarnate Christ, God has become visible. In the icon of Christ, we have neither an image of divinity or humanity. Natures cannot be pictured, but a person can. And the person who is pictured is the divine Logos, the Son of God, who becomes flesh, who takes matter to himself. In the year 787, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, or the Second Council of Nicaea, is convened. The reason why it can be convened is Emperor Constantine Copronymus has finally died, and an empress has come to the throne, Empress Irene, and Empress Irene is in favor of the icons. So a council is convened, and it completely uses this articulation of St. John of Damascus to uphold the teaching of the church. So there is a temporary end of iconoclasm, and the icons are temporarily restored to the churches. But alas, after the death of Irene, yet another series of emperors, this time another Leo the Armenian, continuation of this Armenian dynasty, he resumes the persecution on the same grounds. And in this second half of iconoclasm, the great hero of the church is St. Theodore the Studite. And he's called the Studite because he became the abbot of what was an obscure monastery in the city of Constantinople, pretty much fallen into ruin, and called the Studios, dating from, I believe, the 4th or 5th century. And through the work and example and holiness of Theodore the Studite, this monastery becomes the principal monastery of Constantinople, numbering nearly 1,000 monks, and living a very unified communal life, focusing on liturgical worship and work, particularly taking care of widows and orphans and the poor. So it's one of those cases where the monastic life, in its Studite expression, is very much concerned with doing what we would call, in our modern sense, social work. But anyhow, and because of that, of course, because this huge monastery is at the center of the care of the poor and is second to the great cathedral itself, the focus of the liturgical life of the city of Constantinople, the influence that it has is very considerable among the people. And so in the year 815, when the emperor tries again to promulgate a decree against the icons, St. Theodore and his monks have a tremendous procession on Palm Sunday, carrying icons through the streets, and another bloody persecution breaks out, in which St. Theodore and some of the Studite monks are martyred. St. Theodore, although he is not killed, is treated with great barbarity, both through imprisonment and torture. Nevertheless, he survives it. If you read his life, the things they did to him, it's amazing to imagine how someone could live through what he suffered, but he did. And lived to see the ultimate end of iconoclasm in the year 843, when, with the Patriarch Methodius of Constantinople and again the empress, see, in this case, in this century, the emperors are the bad guys and the empresses are the good girls. Empress Theodora ultimately restores the icons to the churches. This is the event that all the Orthodox celebrate on the first Sunday of Lent every year. The triumph of orthodoxy that occurred in 843, when there was tremendous processions all through not only Constantinople but everywhere throughout the empire, and restoration of the icons. And this was a final restoration. It was the iconoclasm was finally died as a result of this. And why did it die? It didn't have to be crushed by persecution, as the iconoclasts persecuted those who upheld the icons. It died because it had never taken root in the faith of the people. The church, the mind of the church, even though the emperor and many of those in high places adopted it, nevertheless, the mind and the heart of the church would not accept it, and it ultimately died. Now, perhaps we'll close by going just briefly, because we'll pick up next time with the West. Of course, the Pope in Rome, when receiving the decisions of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, ratified them. But there was also another influential person who would receive the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and something unfortunate happened. This was the one who had become the most important and powerful figure in the West, Emperor Charlemagne. And he received a faulty Latin translation. And he knowing no Greek, received the faulty Latin translation of the Declaration of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, in which the St. John of Damascus's word about the relative veneration that is given to the icons was translated from into the Latin adoratio. So Charlemagne read this, and it sounded like the Seventh Council was saying that means that we adore the icons, and he thought, well, that can't be right. So he rejected, kind of on his own authority, the Seventh Ecumenical Council. This in the end, of course, did not take hold in the West, because it was not Charlemagne's position to articulate the faith of the Church. But nevertheless, we have here the beginning of something that had not yet existed. We now have two people, both claiming the position of Roman emperor. The emperor in Constantinople, and this, in the eyes of the Greeks, barbarian that had risen somewhere in the West from among the Franks, whoever they were, in the minds of the Greeks, some barbarian tribe, is now claiming to be emperor of the Romans. And not only is he claiming that title, but he has been crowned as such by the Pope in Rome. So that means that next time we must begin a very active but very sad chapter in the history of the Church that is going to wind up with the ultimate schism between East and West. It's not to claim that this the rise of Charlemagne is the primary cause of the schism. I'm presenting it simply as the beginning of a new chapter in the life of the Church, in which Greek and Latin, East and West, which were becoming gradually going their own way and becoming rather strangers to each other, still nevertheless regarded themselves as the same church everywhere. But now we're going to enter into a period of polarization. So that's where we'll begin next time. And now we can have some questions. Jim?
Why is the two-dimension accepted in the Orthodox Church?
The reason for it is that seems to be primarily I suppose you could say more as a result of cultural than doctrinal influence. The three-dimensional image in the mind of the fathers of the Seventh Ecumenical Council and the teachers of the Church, that if you said three-dimensional image or simply statue to them, that the immediate reaction they would have to that is those indeed were the idols of paganism. They were realistic. They were primarily images of false gods, the gods of the Greek and Roman mythological pantheon. And also because the Greco-Roman Christian art, this new expression of a people that was determined to have artistic expression, tried from the very beginning, And one can see this in the iconographic tradition. There is, without question, an iconographic tradition, just as there is a tradition of liturgical chant, liturgical music. Whether it's in the Greek church or the Latin church, they come from a common source. And all one has to do is study the early iconography, whether from Greek or Latin sources. And one can see that there is never an attempt to have either the realistic portrait or the statue. What there is an attempt to do is to use art to convey theological and spiritual truth. And so the rejection of the three-dimensional realistic statue was from the conviction that this would not be an acceptable means to convey to make images of the heavenly kingdom, of the glorified Lord and his saints, that cannot be imaged simply in a realistic manner in this world. By the way, before one more thing I'll say about that, what's the overall result of the triumph of the veneration of icons, is that, see, remember way back how we talked about those distinct trends in speaking about Christ that one found among the Antiochians and the Alexandrians. And we said that the Antiochians did stress the reality of the humanity of Christ, and the Alexandrians tended to stress the divinity of Christ, that the Antiochians would speak primarily of Christ becoming man, and the Alexandrians would speak primarily of Christ becoming flesh. And it was that Alexandrian tendency that was by far the most dominant influence. And what happened with the icons was a corrective balance to it. Because things were going in the direction of when people would speak of Christ, they would say, well, yes, he assumed humanity. Well, he assumed humanity it's true, but it's not enough. There had to be some sort of reaffirmation that, on the one hand, upheld the tighter union, still not falling into the trap of speaking of Christ as two people, the divine person and the human person. But nevertheless, there had to be a re-emphasis that not only did Christ assume humanity, that in Christ the Son of God becomes a man, a human being, with all of the properties that a human male has. And that's why, and the use of the icon to depict him in that way. That's why we mentioned the Council of Trullo. One of the other things the Council of Trullo said was that they said, up to now we have pictured Christ in many ways, and they speak of the Lamb and some of the other symbolic means that were used to show Christ. They will say, and we receive these because they have come to us from the church as it existed to now. But they said, from now on, we're not going to do this anymore. They say, we will show Christ as he is in his humanity. And that's even a century before or half a century before the iconoclast crisis. So it is the final of the ecumenical councils, you could say, establishes a balance against too much Alexandrian emphasis on the divine person, assuming only the qualities of human nature, or taking humanity to himself, and the danger of that is ignoring that what that means is that he became a real historical flesh and blood man. So the icons are the safeguard of that. Father Luke.
Talked about some of the people before iconoclasm having icons as superstitious things that would have power in themselves, and yet we today have wonder-working icons.
Yes.
In the history of the church.
That's right.
Could you kind of define that in that there's somehow sacramental grace and power given to certain icons?
Oh, certainly. And the Seventh Ecumenical Council made it clear that not only is it good to, and these questions are good because it helps me to mention there's so many details and we have to go so fast, even though it doesn't appear like we're going very fast, that it's so difficult to touch on everything. But the Seventh Ecumenical Council says not only is it good to have icons, it's necessary to have them, it says. And not only is it necessary to have them, it's necessary to venerate them. Before, you know, if you went into a church before the iconoclast crisis, there would be iconography around, be on the walls. There would not be, you see, the iconostasis as we know it now, as the stand with the icons. That's what the word literally means. Is a result of the response to the ultimate restoration of the icons. If you went into a church before iconoclasm, as we said before, there would be a rail of some sort, with not unlike the traditional Western style altar rail, though it was probably rather higher, some kind of chest high. And so in some places, especially in big churches, they would put some pillars up above it, make a kind of arch. And then, gradually, they would, in addition to having icons on the walls in the apse, they would start putting icons there too. And they would put them in places where people could venerate them. But this organized veneration of the icons that everyone does as a sign of faith is the inheritance of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, because it says not only are we to venerate them, we are to venerate them in a specific way. It says with the bow and the kiss, and that becomes the sign that you are Orthodox. Just as before the first couple councils, before the first and second ecumenical councils, the word Trinity was not a familiar word to Christians. But after those councils, you better make it familiar and you better use it, see, if you're going to be expressing the church's faith. Likewise, the mode in which people honored the icons, there was a lot of variety in it before the necessity came to define it with precision. And after it is defined with precision, if you are going to be a member of the body of Christ, you do it in the way that the council has prescribed. And secondly, it made clear that not only through icons, but there was also reaffirmation of the veneration of the relics of the saints, that through these means, it is the grace of God that operates. But it is the grace of God that is operating. It is not the matter of the icon that is operating. It is the grace of God operating by means of the matter. So we would make how we would distinguish between a wonder-working icon and a superstitious use of an icon is superstition. Again, that's a rather modern word. Superstition means that material things are treated as having an inherent power. Many what we call primitive societies, the anthropologists use the expression mana. Mana is a word that refers to the inherent power of something. And this is how some people were treating the icons. So it's not so. Icons, as everything, sacraments, everything in the church, there is a correct use of them and an incorrect use of them. There are wonder-working icons. They are intended to be used in the church in the proper way. They can be misused. In my opinion, I think they probably have been misused from time to time. But the fact that a good thing is used incorrectly does not make it cease being a good thing. It simply means that it's being used incorrectly, and it needs to be used in the proper manner. Does that make sense? Brett? Well, of course, no definitive answer can be given to this. I can give you the opinion which I hold, which the reason why I hold it is a number of eminent historians hold it. But I cannot present it as historical fact, though I certainly believe that it is worthy of credence. And we won't take too long with this, but this is a fascinating study. You want a good book about this, get the book by Ian Wilson, who is one of the best of the students of what we call the Turin Shroud, or if one accepts this theory, the icon not made with hands, which is its original name. And according to this historical study, the shroud of Christ was brought from Jerusalem first to the city of Edessa in Syria by one of the disciples, perhaps by Thaddeus, where it remained until the 10th century, walled up in the city walls of Edessa, for safekeeping because of war. When Edessa when it was considered by Constantinople that it was too dangerous to keep such a precious relic in a Muslim-occupied area, I think I mentioned this before. This tended to be the case in the big cities. They suggested rather strongly that it be given to Constantinople and sent some soldiers, so it would be graciously given and taken to Constantinople, and that's what happened. It was brought to Constantinople in 944. It was sealed up in a frame. They took it out of the frame. They found out that it was not, as was thought up to this point, an icon of the face of Christ, but that it was a big piece of cloth that had been folded in half and then folded in four. And from that time, and this is one of the most convincing arguments, even beyond all the modern analysis and pollen and medical things, from that time, the features, and I think there's a list of some 54 distinct features that are found in the image of the face of Christ on the shroud, begin to appear like wildfire in all the icons of the period. So it is seen as the prototypical icon of the face of Christ, not the icon not made by hands, the icon that comes from Christ's own body. However, during all the period of time of the iconoclast, it was in the wall in the city of Edessa, according to this theory. Yes, Carol.
Why is it that you never see an icon with Christ smiling?
I wonder if Father Luke could answer that better than me. Can you, Father Luke? Yes, and to add to that, the preference or perhaps interpretation of the smile as a kind of nice expression is a rather modern American idea. All one has to do is look at old photographs from anywhere. People did not smile like that. They thought that was being supercilious, as a matter of fact, not being nice. It's the same reason why is Christ never described as laughing in the gospel? I mean, does it mean that Christ never laughed? I don't think so. But there is certainly not in the verbal icon of Christ in the gospel. You can find some humor there, especially if you're familiar with the turns of speech and of the time and the parables especially. But you don't find the kind of telling of jokes and passionate laughter that we would often characterize as such. So you don't find it in the visual icon either. Yeah, they wouldn't show him grinning though. Maybe, although I don't know as a smile would have to be a grin. But perhaps there isn't an absolute answer to that, but it is certainly the case that in the traditional iconography you don't find it. Yeah, I can't think of one. It's Darlene. Okay, we will touch on this question when we get to developments in the late medieval West. Because before the late Middle Ages in the West, the iconographic tradition prevails there. It has its unique expression. But for example, if you take books of Christian art and look at mosaics in Rome and mosaics in the Greek church, it's the same basic expression. But there is a shift that goes on in the West from the late Middle Ages on, not only in art, but in many things. And we will be speaking of that. We're finished? Okay. May God bless us.